In a previous video, I addressed what is probably the most common objection to cosmological arguments or arguments for God as the first cause of the universe, namely, if everything needs a cause, what caused God? You see that everywhere. I gave like 6 examples of where you see it. It's almost like the stock and trade sort of response to that objection. And I made this suggestion that response fails to understand the cosmological argument because it fails to understand the difference between a first cause within a causal series, on the one hand, and on the other hand, an ontologically unique, uncaused first cause. And basically fails to understand what is meant by the word God. Asking what cause, you can deny that there is such a thing as an ontologically unique, uncaused first cause. You can say that doesn't exist. But if you ask what caused it, it's like asking, who is the bachelor's wife? It doesn't understand the thing in question. In this video, I want to address what I see as the other kind of primary category of responses to the cosmological argument, which is basically, and this is more common at the technical level among physicists and cosmologists and so forth. And it's basically to opt for one of these more recent non-standard cosmologies. And so what I'm going to do in this video is take half the time to survey what are these non-standard cosmologies. And the second half, I want to critique Lawrence Krauss and his proposal, which is maybe the main, certainly one of the most well-known of these models. So that's coming up. The word Big Bang was first coined by Fred Hoyle, who was an English astronomer. He really did not like this, so he's getting interviewed in March of 1949, right at the middle of the 20th century. Early 20th century, especially in the 1920s, there'd been all this development of thought as people are realizing that the universe seems to be expanding. And so obviously that's kind of an arresting thought, because you go back in time, you say, how did that start? So Hoyle is advocating for what he calls the steady state model, where you have new matter continually created all the time as it's expanding outward. And this is one of the main alternatives to the Big Bang theory. And he defines the Big Bang theory as it all starts with a Big Bang, and that's where the term comes from. He really did not like that. He thought it was too similar to creationism, basically, to have a beginning to the universe. And so for a while in the mid-20th century, these are the two views that are competing with each other, and basically eventually the Big Bang model won out. So you start to get in the later decades of the 20th century all these different theories about how to understand that initial singularity, where we come to kind of the edge of space-time. And the standard model, drawing from Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose in the 60s and 70s, is basically one where if you assume the validity of general relativity, and you're going back in time, and there's a few other conditions you also assume, such as that energy is always positive, you reach a point at which the initial state is one where time and space and energy and matter are infinite. And the laws of physics break down at that initial singularity. So then, of course, in more recent times, including from Hawking himself, you get all these kind of different models, non-standard models. One of the things that's interesting to see is how emotional this whole development has been, because when the Hawking-Penrose model first came out, that was not greeted with neutrality. I mean, it was very, it was disturbing for a lot of people. And then there's a great sense of relief with some of these non-standard models. And so it's just interesting to observe that. Robert Jastrow is he wrote a fascinating book called God and the Astronomers. He talks about when he's an agnostic. He starts his book off saying he's an agnostic, but he notes how kind of emotional this whole development has been throughout the 20th century. And because obviously there's some pretty profound theological points of resonance with the idea of creation ex nihilo, from nothing, and the standard model of the Big Bang. Maybe they're not the same thing, but they look pretty resonant with each other. So he talks about how basically if people look into this, they're traumatized. And he says scientists find it disturbing because it violates their faith in the sufficiency of natural causes, because science explained the world in terms of natural laws, but The Big Bang's a real mystery, Here you get to a point where the natural laws break down. The laws of physics break down. So how do you explain it? And it brings you to the very edge of the physical. So Jastrow opens his book saying he's an agnostic. At the end of his book, he says, for the scientist who lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries. Now, a lot of people are skeptical. Like, is it really such disturbing news for a naturalist to contemplate the Big Bang? And I think to appreciate that, we have to understand what the word nothing means, at least as Jastrow is using it. Because when I try to think of nothing, I don't think we can actually conceptualize what nothing is. When I try to think of nothing, I find myself just thinking about blackness. But blackness is something. It's the opposite of whiteness and light. So if you ask the question, okay, it's actually impossible. We usually just think of empty space, but when scientists talk about at least the standard model, what they're talking about is not just a empty space or a state of minimal energy or something like this, and then matter or some object or something like that comes into space-time. They're talking about space-time itself coming into existence from nothing. Now, the more you think about it, you can see why this has been such a, as he calls it, a traumatizing idea for people who are trying to explain the world in terms of natural laws and so forth. Here's how Paul Davies, who's a physicist and another agnostic, he puts it like this: the significance of this result cannot be overstated. He's talking about the Big Bang. People often ask, where did the Big Bang occur? The Big Bang did not occur at a point in space at all. Space itself came into existence with the Big Bang. There is a similar difficulty over the question, what happened before the Big Bang? The answer is there was no before. Time itself began at the Big Bang. As we have seen, St. Augustine long ago proclaimed that the world was made with time and not in time, and that is precisely the modern scientific position. Now, so far, this can seem pretty triumphant for the theistic side. And I think sometimes Christian apologists go too quickly, too glibly that direction. And we've got to get into the complexities here and basically look at all these non-standard cosmologies, because that's kind of where the discussion is at right now, is how do you understand this beginning? And then, of course, there's even people like J.L. Mackie. He wrote the book The Miracle of Theism, older British philosopher. He basically says you can even assume the standard picture and just have I think he calls it a sheer unexplained origin of things. And I don't know how to disprove someone who goes that route. I mean, at that point, I'm just saying to J.L. Mackie, more power to you. If you can just accept for no explanation, bang, here comes the universe, then all I'll say is don't say that my worldview is mysterious, because it doesn't get any more mysterious than that. I mean, I would say if someone goes that route, the J.L. Mackie route, congratulations, you've got the most mysterious worldview on the market, way more mysterious than theism, in my opinion. But the most common response is to go with these non-standard cosmologies, and these get really weird. I mean, my favorite one is, it feels like science fiction, a lot of them, but literally there are serious academic articles proposing, even my favorite one is the time loop idea, that the universe creates itself through a time loop. And I won't say anything about that except if you want to Google closed time-like curves and just read about that. It's again, it feels like science fiction. It's pretty interesting. Of course, one of the main ones is the oscillating universe. The universe is infinitely going back and forth, contracting and expanding outward again and back and forth. That's less common now. One of the big ones is called inflation theory. People notice that there's this period of extremely rapid inflation right after the Big Bang. So they say, well, maybe what you have is in some regions of the universe, as inflating regions reproduce themselves and create new universes called bubble universes, those expand at an exponential rate, so that within each bubble universe, its own beginning looks like a Big Bang because the outer material is too far away to observe because it's expanding at an exponential rate. So that's a way you could maybe picture that. I don't know if I explained that well, but so basically you've got this multiverse. It's just eternally expanding over and over. But here's the thing about a lot of these non-standard cosmologies. Most of them, like the main species of the eternal inflation theory, most of them actually don't get out of the fundamental issue because they still have a beginning. You go back to a certain point. The main proponent of the inflation theory is Alan Guth, and he thinks the universe did have that multiverse does have a beginning, does go back to a beginning point. So it doesn't really necessarily get you off the hook. But what I want to do here is talk about the most popular alternative. So I'll put up a picture you can see. If you think about the big standard model is going back to like a sharp point, a singularity. Stephen Hawking and others have proposed a model in which basically you have I think it's called a no boundary theory. So basically as you're going back, time itself breaks down and you get to a state where you really can't measure events. So time is finite, but there's no beginning point. And all of these proposals are, the broad family we're in here is if you think of general relativity and quantum mechanics. These are the two great discoveries in physics throughout the 20th century. General relativity describes the universe at a very large scale, quantum mechanics at a very small scale. You remember that the standard model assumes general relativity, and basically all these models are saying, what if you look at the Big Bang in terms of quantum mechanics instead? So another theory is Vilenkin's tunneling from nothing theory. There's all different kinds of views here, but I want to focus on this one, or at least what Krauss is doing with these models. So Universe from Nothing came out in 2012. The subtitle is Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. That'll be important. This is 2 years after a kind of similar proposal by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow. I can never say his name. Mlodinow. Am I saying that right? Mlodinow. You tell me. Mlodinow. The Grand Design, which came out, I think, in 2010. So basically, let me summarize the significance of this book. Richard Dawkins wrote an afterword to it, and he's basically saying what Origin of Species did for biology, this book has done for cosmology. He calls it a knockout blow to theism. And he closes his afterword by saying, the title means exactly what it says, and what it says is devastating. So I read this book very patiently, very carefully. Now keep in mind, does the book mean exactly what it says? This word nothing is a tricky word. What do we mean by nothing? And what you find is as you try to define that word, you get into one of the trickiest points in the intersection of philosophy and cosmology. Because different people will define that word differently. And this is what all the early reviews of Krauss's book pointed out, is he's not really talking about nothing. And I think it was David Albert in his review in the New York Times pointed this out. He says, this is not something from nothing. And to his credit, Krauss, in the preface to the paperback edition here that I've got in my hand, acknowledges that criticism, and he kind of delimits the purpose of his book. So he's basically saying, yeah, I'm not talking about absolute nothingness. But then he seems to kind of relativize that question. He says, I take a rather flippant attitude toward this concern, the concern about you're not really talking about pure nothingness. I don't think it adds anything to the productive discussion, which is what questions are actually answerable by probing the universe. I have discounted the philosophical issue because I think it bypasses the really interesting and answerable physical questions associated with the origin and evolution of our universe. Now, already I've got worries here. You're discounting the philosophical question because you don't think it's interesting and because you don't think it's answerable by means of your area of training and your interests. That preference for physics rather than philosophy as a way to define this word nothing is itself a philosophy. I don't think you get that very preference, that lack of interest in this way of this angle of approach from any empirical observations of the universe. I think that's kind of a philosophical bias. But maybe I'm wrong. And then you wonder, well, how is the subtitle of the book, which is a philosophical phrase, why there is something rather than nothing, and why is Richard Dawkins saying this is a knockout blow to theism if you're really limiting the book like that, but maybe I'm wrong. I'm going to read the book carefully. So I'm reading through the book. I'm giving it a chance. I'm trying to be a patient reader, trying to understand where he's coming from. Now, most of the book is just him summarizing Einstein, summarizing physics, kind of orienting the reader. So I keep reading, I keep going. I'm kind of waiting, like, where's the punchline here? Where are you going to get to this idea of a universe from nothing? Finally, I get to the last 3 chapters of the book. All right, I want to just finish this video by narrating what I experienced as a reader finishing Krauss's book. In these last 3 chapters, he offers 3 different definitions of the word nothing. First, his first definition is basically empty space. And he acknowledges this isn't really nothing. He's constantly qualifying it by saying it's almost nothing, or what could maybe qualify as nothing. But he acknowledges the empty space is endowed with energy and it's governed by physical laws. So it's really not nothing. In fact, he even says it would be disingenuous to suggest that empty space endowed with energy, which drives inflation, is really nothing. So I keep reading, because I want to get to the subtitle. I want to get to what Richard Dawkins summarizes as the point of the book. He didn't, the book is not called A Universe from almost nothing, right? And he recognizes that. So he gets to his second definition of nothing, which basically here he's saying once you allow for the merging of quantum mechanics and general relativity, for those 2 things to merge, you can extend the argument to where space itself is forced into existence. And there he's more tentative. He admits that this doesn't prove this a beginning from nothing, but he says it creates the possibility. But even here, we've still got a problem, namely, quantum mechanics and general relativity are not nothing. They're particular laws that govern and are only observed in relation to space-time. So you have to say, okay, we still got to get to not really nothing, right? And he recognizes that concern again. In the book's last chapter, he addresses it. And so finally, I'm like, okay, it takes a lot of patience to get through this book. I mean, science stuff is not my main thing, though it's kind of interesting to me, especially on this conversation. But finally, I get to the last chapter, and I'm like, okay, here it is, right? So he spends a lot of time, if I may say this without giving offense, he spends a lot of time in this last chapter kind of hemming and hawing. He's trying to downplay the philosophical principle, out of nothing, nothing comes. He reiterates the what caused God objection a lot. He's kind of trying to position himself and maneuver, And then finally, we get his solution in the last few pages. I was like, I should have just read the last few pages of the book. And it's 2 things. Number 1, basically, it's a multiverse. So, the multiverse is lots of maybe infinite number or many, many, many universes out there, each one governed by different physical laws. And then the anthropic principle, which is the idea that the universe appears to us the way it does because of our location within it. And then from that he concludes, in a multiverse of any of the types that have been discussed, there could be an infinite number of regions, potentially infinitely big or infinitesimally small, in which there is simply nothing, and there could be regions where there is something. In this case, the response to why there is something rather than nothing comes almost trite. There is something simply because if it were nothing, we wouldn't find ourselves living here. Then he acknowledges that that's kind of a frustrating answer. But he says, the history of science teaches us that the universe is counterintuitive. Truth doesn't conform to our wishes or our expectations. And then he concludes like this. Why is there something rather than nothing? Ultimately, this question may be no more significant or profound than asking why some flowers are red and some are blue. Something may always come from nothing. It may be required, independent of the underlying nature of reality. Or perhaps something may not be very special or even very common in the multiverse. Either way, what is really useful is not pondering this question, but rather participating in the exciting voyage of discovery that may reveal specifically how the universe in which we lived evolved and is evolving. And that's it. That's the end of the argument. All you get after that is a page and a half of basically saying the universe is going to go back to nothing. So at one point he's like, Why is there something other than nothing? Well, there won't be for long. And that's kind of, and then he's got a brief epilogue. And I'll never forget my disappointment and my surprise. Here I am. I'm persevering, and I'm waiting, and I'm thinking, okay, I got several problems right now. Number one, your proposal is so speculative. You haven't proven the universe from nothing. You're saying, maybe it could be like this. It's highly speculative. Number two, you're downplaying the significance of the question at hand. Ultimately, you write this book proposing that you're going to have a way to understand something from nothing, but ultimately what it comes down to is kind of diverting away from the question because you don't find it that interesting. He's saying it's kind of like why some flowers are red and some are blue. It feels like he's relativizing the question. Number three, a multiverse is still not nothing. A multiverse is about almost as opposite from nothing as you can get. And I'm not understanding how that rabbit got pulled out of the hat. But number four, and here's the biggest thing, he himself derives the conclusion from his argument that therefore God is unnecessary. The last sentence of the book is, God is unnecessary or at least redundant. And he says elsewhere, he summarizes his book as saying, it's possible not to believe in God. Religious belief is less and less necessary. We live in a world without purpose or guidance. So he's summarizing the conclusions of his proposal as having relevance to the question of God. Those words, without the need for divine guidance. But Krauss has acknowledged in his preface he's not dealing with or even interested in the question of pure nothingness. And to the extent that that question comes in very briefly at the end of his book, it's speculative and inconclusive and just kind of downplaying the nature of the question. So how could you get the non-involvement of God from such a proposal? And yet, this is this is the main one on the market. So what I would say is I want to put up Paul Davies' assertion again, where he says, time itself began with the Big Bang. As we have seen, St. Augustine long ago proclaimed that the world was made with time and not in time, and that is precisely the modern scientific position. It looks to me like that concern is still on the table. And if it isn't, if there's another way to understand the origins of our universe, then I don't think we've got it from Krauss. I think we need another answer. Tell me what you think. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this, of course, I appreciate you liking and subscribing. And let me know if there's other topics related to this or other questions about this you want me to explore in another video. Hey, thanks for watching.